All right. Yeah, I was just vibing out to that North Coast by Flesh and Bone, from Flesh and Bone and such like that, off his like '96 debut album. Damn, I was like about 3 or 4 years old when this album came out. Ain't that a bitch? But anyway, let's get back. This your boy Blak G 92, and I'm going to do a reaction to another Wrestle with Andy video / documentary titled "Failed Beginnings: Wrestling's Worst Debut." And shout out to Christina for the reaction requests, and also today is her B-Day, so happy birthday to you. So I'm going to see what this video is looking like in about 3, 2, 1. Let's go. Let's get it.
Only get one chance to make a good first impression, and so that's why it's
I'm going to play it back.
In wrestling, you only get one chance to make a good first impression, and so that's why it's critical your debut be a great one, because if it is, it can carry you far. But unfortunately, for every Chris Jericho or Kane out there are those who fall on the opposite end of the spectrum too.
Damn.
But which introductions were the worst of them all? That's exactly what we're going to be looking at today. So join us as we take a deep dive into
Let's get to it.
Wrestling's worst debuts. And of course, if we're going to start anywhere today, there really is only one place to do so, with the most infamous example of a bad debut out there, the Shockmaster.
Shockmaster.
This one has become a punchline amongst fans for a reason, as nowhere else in wrestling history has a big introductory segment been so badly botched. But what was the story here? Well, basically,
I want to know this.
Hyping up that year's War Games match during August 18th's Clash of the Champions 24, Sting and Davey Boy Smith were confronted by Sid and Harlem Heat, with the heel trio demanding to know who the babyface's partner would be at this point. And that's when things fell off the rails, because once Sting announced the introduction of the Shockmaster, a sparkler went off and Fred Ottman, the former Tugboat, crashed through a cheap plywood wall looking like an out-of-work Kool-Aid. But he didn't just crash through the wall, though he also tripped on a 2x4 on his way through, and then proceeded to fall flat on his face, something which caused his poorly painted toy Startrooper mask to fall off and reveal his identity to the world. Really, it couldn't have gone worse if he'd tried, and this was evident in the...
Damn, it's crazy how like Family Guy's parody of the Kool-Aid Man went better than that guy's entrance. That is funny.
That you could audibly hear the British Bulldog shout, "He fell on his arse" afterwards. So it should go without saying then that after this disaster, the Shockmaster was dead in the water, and while he would hang around in WCW for a while after this, he'd very quickly be repackaged as a comedy klutz who couldn't do anything right, no matter how hard he tried. Still, at least Ottman seems to have found the funny side of things in the end, as he can still to this day be seen with his Shockmaster helmet at fan conventions. And company booker Dusty Rhodes appears to have been able to laugh as well, as he would reportedly joke with Vince McMahon over the years which followed when asking him which was worse, the Shockmaster, or our next subject, the Gobbledygooker.
Oh, God, what
if
the
Fred
fuck?
Ottman falling through a wall was WCW's biggest debut fail, then Hector Guerrero in a bad turkey costume was surely WWF's. But again, let's rewind a second, because there was a story to this one too.
Oh, I want to hear this.
The story was, in the lead up to the 1990 Survivor Series, a giant egg had begun appearing on TV. So with fans being told it was only a matter of time until this hatched, they understandably started speculating on who might be inside. Would it be, as one popular theory foretold at the time, Ric Flair making the jump over from WCW? Or would it be someone more new to them already? That latter suggestion was certainly what a young Mark Calloway feared, as given he'd only just recently signed with the company at this point, he now worried that he was going to debut as the Eggman. In the end, though, it would be neither of these. No, it would be far worse, because partway through the show, Mean Gene Okerlund was tasked with finally finding out what was inside the egg. And as he stood there then, the thing finally hatched to reveal one of the worst-looking turkey costumes known to man.
Yeah,
but that wasn't
terrible.
all, because after that, the Gobbledygooker, as Gene quickly christened him, started clucking and dancing his way about the ringside area, forcing the interviewer to do the same. What had been the point of all this? Well, it appears it was supposed to create a new mascot for the company. That said, after it bombed so spectacularly on night one, any plans for such an eventuality were quickly dropped.
I bet.
Yes, clearly Vince McMahon has a thing for bad egg storylines.
Sounds about right, man, because what was that man thinking of having a turkey as a mascot? how would that fly well? I wouldn't even I wouldn't even know how that was going to translate, because yeah, it doesn't even sound right. And plus the costume kind of look cheap as fuck as well. So let's get back to it.
Series. Of course, when the infamous golden egg angle occurred in 2021, it was only a few months after another botched debut had seen the once promising Piper Niven get saddled with the role of Dewdrop. Seriously.
With the Wells Fargo
hate these goddamn commercials. Fuck.
Cashback on what you want. Like
and by the way, I had a chance to throw on the shirt before I started this reaction video.
Baby shoes without laces. The Wells Fargo Active Cash Card. That's real life ready.
It's time to stop staring at this Dunkin' sausage, egg, and cheese. And time to go get this Dunkin' sausage, egg, and cheese. For $3 with a medium or larger coffee.
Alright, shut up.
Seriously, who thought this was a good idea? Take a powerhouse wrestler who could easily serve as an imposing force in the division and immediately make her seem silly by giving her a name like Dewdrop. Really, it boggles the mind.
Yeah, Dewdrop is a goofy name.
Born star had already proven she was someone who could get over under her prior gimmick during her time with NXT UK. Hell, even that's not the worst of it as it happens. No, the worst aspect of the entire debut is that Dewdrop was written to be nothing more than a lackey to Eva Marie of all people, meaning that there was absolutely no hope of her ever getting over under those conditions, no matter how much potential she had. All we can say is thank God Triple H now has at least some creative control over WWE then, because if we still had to deal with this stuff exclusively, the New York product would be completely unwatchable.
I'm sure it would have.
During his latter days, Vince McMahon has made a lot of questionable booking decisions. And if you need any evidence of this, just look at what he did to our next bad debut when they first hit the main roster in 2020. That's right, it's time to talk about Bianca Belair. Now, usually when someone who's been presented as a big deal on NXT gets their main roster debut, it's done so in a way that shines as big a light on them as possible.
Oh, for sure.
But in the case of Bianca, one of the top stars of the developmental brand's women's division, her introduction left a lot to be desired. Why was this? Well, at WrestleMania 36, the one which took place in an empty warehouse, the Knoxville native made her first real impression to main roster fans by running down to save her real-life husband Montez Ford from a beatdown at the end of the Street Profits match against Angel Garza and Austin Theory. And sure, you could argue this one was as bad as it was because there were no fans in attendance, but even if there had been, what a limp way to debut someone.
Yeah.
Seriously, you had the night after WrestleMania right there the following evening, the time when so many great introductions have taken place. Of course, we can't entirely rule out the possibility that this was the original plan, though, and that things were changed once the world shut down. So at least WWE can't.
Yeah, oh boy, the pandemic just ruined everything. Just threw off all type of shit. But I ain't gonna go on no rant about how the COVID thing just had everybody in the loop and just going crazy and sounding fucking retarded. But anyway, yeah. They probably could have found a better way to introduce this like person into NXT, not NXT, but WCW and shit like that. So, yeah.
Here. That's right, the empty arena screwed up a lot of promising debuts for a lot of people during 2020 and the first half of 2021.
Sounds about right.
And if you want another example of this being the case, you only have to look to someone we just mentioned a moment ago, and that's Austin Theory.
I never heard this nigga.
With Bianca Belair, you could argue this one would have flopped with or without fans being there, as it wasn't exactly an auspicious introduction to someone Vince McMahon would soon be pushing as his future face of the company. Why was that? Well, after first appearing on the March 30th episode of Raw, just days after the world shutdown began, he'd quickly be slotted into the dreaded mid-card tag team role after he was paired up with Angel Garza. And yes, Angel Garza is a very talented wrestler, just as his manager at the time, Zelina Vega, is very talented on the mic. But if the way they were being booked on the main roster at that point was any sign of what was to come for Theory, then he had every reason to worry. Seriously. By the time WrestleMania 36 came around a week later, the Georgia native was already being jobbed out to much bigger teams. So maybe it's a blessing in disguise that not long after this he'd be sent back down to NXT, where he could become a member of The Way. And while he was doing this then, he was able to rebuild himself to the point where, once he returned to Raw in 2021, things would go a lot better for him. Of course, not everyone gets a second chance like this, however. No, most of the time when a performer's debut falls flat, that's the way it'll remain.
Yep.
And this is something another figure whose big entrance was hurt by the worldwide shutdown can attest to. Who are we talking about this time? Why, El Hijo del Fantasma.
Quite the long-ass name.
Without saying that Fantasma is one of the best luchadors in the world today. Someone who, prior to joining up with WWE, was able to make quite a name for himself in CMLL, AAA, and even Lucha Underground for a spell. So
okay, so he built a name for himself. Okay, I wonder how they fucked this up.
According to NXT in August of 2019, excitement was through the roof.
I bet it was.
Excitement will ultimately have to be put on ice for a while because pretty quickly after he put pen to paper, Fantasma suffered a knee injury which kept him on the shelf for the next few months. And this unfortunately meant that, by the time he was finally ready to hit the ring, the world had dramatically changed, and there were no longer any fans in attendance at shows.
Yeah.
Sure, this was no fault of the Mexico City natives, and you could argue he did everything he could have done at this point to show that he was a star in waiting.
Yeah.
But even if he had all the skill in the world, the reality was, when he took part in a tournament to crown an interim cruiserweight champion in April of 2020, and then went as far as to win the entire thing, it all felt just a little less than it should have on account of there being absolutely no atmosphere.
Yeah.
As well as this, pretty quickly after his big title win, Fantasma would get the WWE name change treatment when he morphed into Santos Escobar. Could it have been different if fans were there? Absolutely.
I sure would have.
Except for the name change, that was going to happen anyway. But it was what it was, and since then he's at least been able to bold himself up to the point that, now with live crowds in attendance once more, Escobar and the rest of his Legado del Fantasma stablemates have been able to make a successful shift over to the main roster as part of the newly reformed LWO.
Okay.
Yes, even if you do have a bad debut initially, things can work out okay in the end.
Well, that's good to hear. That's good for him.
Even better than anyone would have dared expect. And if you need any evidence of this, you only have to look to the pretty humble beginnings Steve Austin had in mid-90s WWF when he debuted as the Ringmaster. Okay, whose idea was it to take one of the more charismatic figures of his generation and saddle him with such a stupid character right out of the gate? Well, if you need us to tell you that, then you haven't been paying attention. That's right, even back before the turn of the millennium, Vince McMahon was making some pretty suspect choices when it came to his performers. And one of the worst of all during this time period was to have the man...
It seemed like every time there's some sort of like mishaps on the roster, such, what you call it, Vince McMahon is always in the middle of that shit. It seems like. Even back in those grand 90s, he doing some suspect shit, it seems like.
Go on to become the biggest draw in the history of the industry, play a technically solid mid-carder who never spoke. Now, sure, he got to have Ted DiBiase for a manager, and he was also allowed to carry the $1 million title around his waist, but for someone with as much talent as the Rattlesnake, this was more of an albatross than a help. No, what he really needed was promo time and an opportunity to show his real character. No-nonsense, ass-kicking Texan who could serve as a stand-in for everyone around the world that hated their boss. Sadly, though, at least for the first few months of his run in New York, Austin would have to suffer through mid-card hell as he did his best impression of a glorified jobber taking part in matches against the likes of a young Matt Hardy.
Boo.
So thank God he was allowed to change things up in the spring of 1996 then, when after shaving his head, growing a goatee, and adopting a far more cold and calculating killer of a gimmick, he morphed into Stone Cold Steve Austin. And he's not the only rebel hero of the people-type character who managed to grow out of the ashes of a pretty poor debut. No, someone who many people consider to be the modern-day female counterpart of Austin also left a pretty bad impression with audiences when she first started in NXT during 2013. That said, this
Becky
wasn't
Lynch.
any fault of Becky Lynch's, it was all down...
it's this goddamn... I might buy that damn shit.
Get cable-free live TV with no hidden fees.
Okay, shut up. I'm trying to get this reaction.
YouTube TV.
It was all down to the terrible dancing gimmick she'd been given. Quick, come up with an idea for a character to give the new Limerick-born wrestler who's been signed to a developmental contract for your company. If your first suggestion was a bad Riverdance parody, then you might be ready for a job in WWE.
Sounds about
and
right.
What made this one even worse was that Becky Lynch was no random performer who was going to sink to the mid-card for the rest of her career. No, once she actually got something to work with years later, she'd become arguably the biggest star in women's wrestling history.
Okay.
Back during those early days, though, you would have never guessed this was going to be the case, as after poorly shuffling her way down to the ring decked out in emerald green gear, Becky was left to deal with the fact that no one was taking her seriously. And that was probably why she struggled so much to get over during her early time on the black and gold brand.
That can explain
Thankfully, she was talented
everything.
enough to overcome this in the end, because by the time the decade was over, she'd be the first woman to ever pick up a win in the main event of WrestleMania. It's just a shame the same can't be said for our next subject then, at least not yet, because when it comes to Chelsea Green, she's still to some degree recovering from a pretty awful debut in 2019. That said, the disaster which was her introduction can't entirely be put down to WWE Creative at this point because, while there was no doubt a whopper of a gimmick awaited her, before it could really take shape, the Canadian broke her wrist at an NXT house show in March of that year. And sure, while this could have been a fairly minor setback in the grand scheme of things, the idea she was injury-prone was only added to when, upon healing up and making her main roster debut in November of 2020, Green broke her wrist again.
Damn.
And what made this second injury even worse was that not only was the match it took place in supposed to see her win and go on to be a part of that year's SmackDown Women's Survivor Series team, but this was her first introduction to a larger audience. After she realized she was hurt once again, though, the finish would be changed at the last minute to have Liv Morgan go over instead, meaning the former Impact star's moment in the sun would slide through her fingers here as, by the time she'd healed up again in April of 2021, WWE would have released her from her contract. Still, at least she's been able to recover somewhat since then by returning to the company with a new Karen gimmick, and even if this gimmick is pretty undercard in its nature, it's better than having no job at all. When it comes to our next...
I suppose, man. Because, you know, the Karen, like, you know, like persona such does get tiresome after a while. But, hey, if she's happy, I'm happy for her.
So, having no job at all may actually have been a better option than what he was originally saddled with back in the doldrums of 2020, because it was at this point that Omos made his Monday Night Raw debut as a giant ninja.
Okay.
Yes, a giant ninja. That was the gimmick Vince McMahon had seen in the Big Man when he first laid eyes upon him earlier in the year. Why a ninja exactly? Well, he was a part of Akira Tozawa's ninja faction. That's right, Tozawa was being presented as a purveyor of the warrior way. And so, needing to have a crew of silent assassins by his side at all times then, if he wanted to keep his hands on the cherished and highly prized 24/7 title, he decided to bring in the big guns when, on June 25th, an incredibly large man in a mask helped him to escape with the victory. Really, we can't emphasize enough just how stupid and painful this was to watch when it was airing. In fact, it's a miracle Omos survived the whole incident at all, and the only reason he did even that was probably because his face was hidden for most of it. So when the company decided to scrap the whole thing and instead rebrand him as Shane McMahon's personal bodyguard during the short-lived Raw Underground later that year, at least he has plausible deniability when asked where he'd been before. And this allowed him to slowly work his way up the ranks again without the stink of such a terrible introduction being on him. Of course, if Omos was watching in the early 2000s, he'd have already known it was possible for a big man to achieve success in spite of a pretty terrible debut gimmick. And the reason for that is because back then, Hollywood star Dave Bautista was first introducing himself to fans as the far less interesting Deacon Bautista. But wait, what was this one all about?
Well, that's what I'm wondering too.
In the 2002 WWE Draft, the Dudley Boys were split up and sent off to different brands so they could try out their hand at being singles competitors. And while for Bully Ray this meant pretty much keeping the same character, for Devon it instead meant a complete rebrand as Reverend Devon, a corrupt church leader who only cared about making sure he came out on top at all times. So in order to guarantee he always got his way then, the former Dudley boy brought in a deacon to help him get the better of his opponent during matches. A deacon who turned out to be none other than a young Dave Bautista. Obviously then, this was a pretty lame gimmick compared to the one he later became famous for, mostly on account of the fact he never spoke, and was treated like little more than a lackey for the babyface of the week to get through on their way to the real star. It was dead on arrival, if we're being honest. And that's why it's lucky Big Dave got a second chance to prove himself a year later when he got drafted over to Raw, and from there, became a member of Evolution. And you all know what happened after that. Batista became one of the biggest stars of his generation. So much so that a whole bunch of former WWE stars would grow up watching him, as was the case with our next subject today, Alexa Bliss. But wait, I hear you say, didn't Alexa have a pretty good start on the main roster? After all, she was only on SmackDown for a few months in 2016 before she became that brand's women's champion. Well, yes, that's true, but her actual introduction on NXT 3 years prior had nowhere near the same level of good booking involved. Why was this? Well, because she was about as far away from the bratty mean girl character which later made her famous as anyone could be at this point. No, instead of letting her heel verbal skills shine on the mic, Alexa's debut in NXT saw her come out to the ring as what appeared to be a cheerleader fairy of some kind, one who blew glitter all over the place as she carried on down the aisle. Yeah, it was pretty lame and didn't allow Bliss the chance to show any real character at all. The closest thing we can compare it to really is the generic cheerleader gimmick Julia Hart had over in AEW before she transformed into evil Stevie Nicks. So it should go without saying then that this one didn't really get over with fans, and for a while at least, it looked like the goddess might never even make it to the main roster. Luckily though, by the time she joined forces with Blake and Murphy, the Ohio native was able to start getting things back on track, and this allowed her to recalibrate herself in preparation for her eventual Blue Brand debut. And it's just as well she did, because like with so many of the other people we've looked at today, had she not overcome such a terrible start, WWE would have surely lost a big part of what fans tune in for today.
Yeah, she definitely would.
I used to believe that asking for help or going to therapy...
That was quite the video.
It was a sign of weakness, especially as a man.
Shut up. I ain't trying to hear all that shit. Even though he's saying some realness, I ain't trying to hear all that in the commercial. But yeah, that was... Failed Beginnings Wrestling Worst Debut. And that was pretty insightful little documentary showing that, you know, not all this hope is lost when you have a terrible introduction to the wrestling industry, what may have you. And, you know, also there's showed the example of those that didn't work, that just affected them throughout their career and such. That is insane when you think. I wouldn't say insane, but that's just how the world is sometimes, you know what I mean? Certain introductions just follow you wherever you go. So if you want me to react to more of these Wrestle with Andy videos, be sure to post them in the comment section below, as well as any other videos you have in mind, as well as if you want me to follow me on my social media accounts, they'll be posted in the description box below. And also be sure to follow me as well on those social media accounts. And hit that like button, hit that notification button, hit that subscribe button as well, so then you can stay tuned what I have in store. This your boy Blak G 92 about to sign off. Holla at your boy.